Hey folks, we are going to get started in just a second. All right, folks, we're going to get started. That's going to be a problem. All right, now we're going to get started. My name is Chris Matthews. Welcome. I'm chair of the Social Democratic Caucus PAC. Very happy that we have such a great turnout. Thank you all for showing up. Want to make some introductions first. We have some of our Democratic Party dignitaries in the room. Want to start with our Scituate Town Committee Chair, Patrice Metro. We have John Dealey, Chair of the Hingham Democratic Town Committee. We have Michael Grafton doing check-in, Chair of the Weymouth Democratic Town Committee. John Bowes, Chair of the Marshfield Democratic Town Committee. And I think we have representation from from 7 out of our 8 town committees on the South Shore tonight. Duxbury wishes they could be here, but they are fighting for an override that's facing some opposition, and they're doing a meeting on that tonight. So very grateful that you're all here. And John Bowes is also our Democratic State Committee man for our Senate district. I also hold that position. John Dealey serves on the Democratic State Committee as well. So there's a lot of party folks here who are very interested to hear your questions and to hear from Jane as well. So some housekeeping items. We have folks streaming online. If the folks online have questions, you can ask them either in the chat if you're on YouTube, on Facebook. You can ask them in the feed on the webinar page. You can email us. There's a bunch of different options, so we'll get your questions asked. Questions in the room. Jane, who I'll introduce shortly, has been very generous with her time. She wants to answer every question. So we'd like to kind of wrap things up by 8:30, but we have the room for the whole night. So if folks want to stick around, my only warning is I would like to get home at some point. And the lights turn off in the parking lot at 9. So we should probably try and get out of here at like 8:55 because it gets a little sketchy out there. So beyond that, I want to get to some of the data, but talk about the South Shore Democratic Caucus first. We're a coalition of the 8 Democratic Town Committees in the 1st Plymouth and Norfolk District. If Senator Pat O'Connor is your state senator, you're in our district. If you're not in our district, if you're not in one of these 8 towns, we are more than happy to have you here. We work with all the surrounding towns and the whole region. So very grateful to have you here. And some folks, anybody not familiar with the Democratic Town Committees? Every town has a Democratic and a Republican town committee. Up to 35 people are elected to help lead the party in town every 4 years in the presidential primary ballot. And in our 8 towns here on the South Shore, we meet monthly. These days, we're talking a lot about what we need to do differently. That's part of why we're here tonight. We want to hear kind of what happens so we can get a better idea of what we need to do differently. We're going to be having more meetings like this to really dive in on how we can do things differently here on the South Shore to make a difference, not just here. And I know that sounds strange that we need to make a difference here in Massachusetts, but you'll see in a second why, and also how we can make an impact across the country. If you're interested in joining your town committee, if you live in Hingham, Weymouth, Marshfield, or Scituate, talk to your chair tonight. If your town's not represented, we're more than happy to get you connected. I know there's a lot of DTC members here, but if you're not a DTC member, we need your involvement now more than ever. A little bit about what the SSDC was able to do last year. We raised more than $10,000, which we used to support local state legislative races. We got more than 1,000 Harris Wall signs out on the South Shore. We hosted regular voter contact events. I think most folks probably encountered John Bowes at some point during the election cycle, whether it was holding signs, doing postcards, making phone calls, knocking on doors. And we also put together a federal political action committee that helped to get 95 people, so nearly 100, 95 folks to Pennsylvania on the doors for Harris Walls. And in the states the battleground states where we did have huge field programs, it was a lot closer than it was elsewhere. So it made a difference. And we're going to be doing that next year. We're going to be doing it this year as special elections occur. So definitely see me after the presentation if you're interested in getting involved at a state. So that's a little bit about the SSDC. Why are we here tonight? We're here first and foremost to hear from Jane because she is a polling expert. Sorry. We're here to hear from Jane. She's giving her hot take on the election, and she's here to answer a lot of questions. That's the priority. What we're not, unfortunately, here to do is to focus on everything that went wrong. The plan was to do this prior to the inauguration. I think we've all experienced the past 2 weeks, and we can understand why we wanted to focus on this before the election, or before the inauguration. But it's still important to have this conversation, and then focus on next steps to better organize here on the South Shore. So just wanted folks to kind of see. This is, I should have labeled this. This was the result this year, obviously, Kamala Harris and Trump in each town. And then this was how Biden did. And you'll see we lost vote share in each town. It wasn't huge, but it was enough that it's concerning. Why is it concerning in Massachusetts? We're always going to vote blue. It's concerning because we have an election next year. Maura Healey and Governor Maura Healey and Attorney General Andrea Campbell are our firewall. They are what is protecting us from the Trump administration here in Massachusetts. There's a lot of heat on them right now. If anybody has been to their town meeting, you've listened to the MBTA discussion, you know there's a lot of anger. And we need to be organized here on the South Shore, not only so we can support out-of-state races in the next presidential race, but we need to be able to support the gubernatorial race and the whole Democratic ticket, because it's just so important. It's more important than ever to have a Democratic attorney general and governor. So that's why we're here tonight. We want to focus both locally and nationally, and we want to make sure that we're all working together to make a difference. So that's all you have to hear from me tonight, fortunately. I'm going to hand it over to Jane. Jane is an expert on polling. She's done a million things, and she just started a new firm called Benchmark Strategy. I just learned it, so that's why I stuttered. And I'm going to hand it off to her to talk a little bit about her background and give her hot take.
Thank you, Chris. Hi, everybody. How are y'all tonight? Good. Okay. As you can tell, my name is Jane Rayburn. As Chris just mentioned, I am a pollster by trade. So my day job is looking at numbers and helping advise campaigns how to take action on them. What do they do in electoral scenarios? As Chris just mentioned, I just stood up my own shop. I'm on day 3. It feels like day 300. But I have been a pollster for darn near 20 years at this point, yet I've not aged a day, right? Isn't that amazing? And I've really had the privilege of having the majority of my career here in Massachusetts. I actually started in this industry as back in the early 2000s as a telephone interviewer. So I was the person who sat in the call house, who made the calls, who interrupted you during dinner and said, who are you going to vote for? And then I gave you a bunch of information about the candidates or the ballot measure, and then asked you again who you would vote for. And I kept you on the phone for 20 minutes. And some of you probably hung up on me, but that's okay. I forgive you because we're here tonight. So I've really worked on races here in Massachusetts and nationally, up and down the ballot. Just to name some of the ones that you might be more familiar with here in Massachusetts, I had the privilege of working on the unionization of rideshare drivers here in Massachusetts, the only ballot measure that passed in 2024, and having a woo labor. We're very excited about that. I also had the privilege of working with now State Senator Dylan Fernandez in the neighboring district. He had a really tough race. I think a lot of people thought that it was a done deal. We knew it wasn't, and Dylan really worked his tail off. So I'm very proud of that. I also work for the House Victory Fund with Speaker Mariano. I work with Senators Edwards, Sear, Roush, and a couple of other names that you probably know. Nationally, I've really worked, across the country. If the y'all didn't give it away that I'm not from the South Shore of Massachusetts, I am from Florida, so I do a lot of work in my home state. It is gnarly down there, and I'm happy to talk with y'all about what you can do here to help states like Florida, but I do a lot of work in Florida, in Georgia, in Iowa, and New Hampshire. So this past cycle, I had the privilege of working with both the House and Senate caucuses of the legislature in New Hampshire. As you all might know, a lot of people thought we were taking back the House and maybe breaking even in the Senate in New Hampshire. Neither of those things happened. In fact, the minority leader in New Hampshire actually lost her seat in the Senate. The House lost 20 seats. By my estimation, they should have lost more like 50. So just a good reminder that even when you lose, sometimes you're winning if it could be worse, right? So, across the board, a lot of what I've had a lot of these conversations. I don't think anybody in here would have been there, but were any of y'all with me in Sharon a couple months ago? Okay. Because if you were, please stay, but it's going to be the same. So one of the things that I just want to highlight, and you won't see me sharing a bunch of slides tonight. I'm not here to pummel you with data and say, and we could have performed a half a point better in Fall River, but really talk to you a little bit about conceptually what we're learning about these races, both Massachusetts and nationally and federally, right? Big differences between state and local and federal races that happened in 2024. And we saw some of that here in Massachusetts as well, right? The state was carried by Vice President Harris, but we lost seats in the House here in Massachusetts. Fall River and that area almost went for Trump. That's never happened in Massachusetts by half a point, right? We had 4 other ballot measures that lost. And so there were some big discrepancies here. And really, kind of the hottest take of all, I hate to break it to you folks, and please don't leave when I say this, but we still don't totally know. And the reason for that is because secretaries of states in all of the states across the country are responsible for recording the data, reporting it back to the DNC, who uploads it into the voter file, and then nerds like me look at it and process it. We have only received, I believe, 2 states out of 50. Right? So that's actually normal. So we typically don't receive that data until March or April. So it's really my biggest thesis statement, if you all can take anything away from this conversation, is wait for the data before we jump to conclusions. Now, that being said, there's plenty of things that we already know, and I'm here to talk with you all about some of them. So the first thing I'll ask is, how many of you knocked doors this cycle for a candidate? All right. How many of you knocked doors out of state for a candidate? All right, it's pretty good. So we got a couple here. The number one thing that we know so far about the data this year is that turnout across the board was down, right? We had an environment where we had voters who were not motivated, who were not excited to show up and vote on both sides of the aisle. And the number one thing that research and experiments have showed time and time again, that the best way to get somebody to show up and vote is for them to have a conversation, preferably with the candidate. But of course, at the federal level, that's very unlikely. But particularly at the state and local levels, the best way is for somebody to have that conversation. We saw the highest turnout, I think, in Massachusetts in 2020. This year, turnout in Massachusetts was down almost 10%. So turnout this year was in the mid to high 60s. In 2020, it was in the mid 70s. A normal presidential turnout is anywhere between 71 and 77% in most states. So even just on the surface of that, we're saying, okay, we have fewer people who are showing up to turn out to vote, right? And a lot of those folks, byproducts of this year's election, happen to be Democrats or Democratic-leaning folks, right? The number one thing that we know is that turnout was across the board. Turnout was down in Boston. It was some of the lowest turnout we've ever seen. How many of you knew that there was a precinct in Boston that Trump won? Yeah, Florian Hall in Dorchester. So Donald Trump won Florian Hall in Dorchester this year, right? And it had one of the lowest turnouts that it's had in a long time. A product of that is, for us to win, we have to show up, right? And so a lot of the hot takes that you've seen or the ink that's been spilled in the press or things about that are, why didn't people show up? I think a lot of it we saw in our polling very, very early on. So we saw polling across the board, specifically in swing states. As I mentioned, I do a lot of work in Iowa as well as New Hampshire, where we were still seeing voters indicate that they were going to vote for Democrats even though they didn't like them. Right. So we saw President Biden who had disapproval ratings that were at the same level as President Trump, but people were still voting for him. Right. The same thing was true with Kamala Harris. The reason for that, our research showed, was pretty different in the way that the reasons that people thought about these two different things. But overall, a primary challenge that we saw in this election as Democrats is we simply just didn't have voters who were as overwhelmingly motivated as they have been in the past to show up and vote. We all know that voting is a choice, right? People often think of voting as a binary choice. You can vote for the Democrat, you can vote for the Republican, you can vote red, you can vote blue, you can vote for this candidate in the primary or that candidate, right? But voting is actually a choice fundamentally between showing up and not showing up at all, right? And unfortunately, this year, particularly in places where we had some of our worst losses, we had voters who just simply didn't show up. So number one, if you want to unpack what happened, folks just didn't show. Now, why is that? There are many, many, many reasons. If anybody is interested in sponsoring some retrospective research, please give me a shout at the end of this presentation. But what we're really seeing fundamentally are a couple of different things. We're seeing voters, so the federal level, it used to be the case. So if you look at a state like Iowa or New Hampshire, voters in those states ticket split. Here in Massachusetts, it's very unlikely that people ticket split, right? But in these states that are swing states, we see voters who ticket split, and they ticket split for different reasons. In New Hampshire, they would ticket split based off of different candidates, right? In 2020, we saw President Biden carry the state as well as all of the federal delegation in Congress, right? However, they lost the House, the Senate, and the Executive Council in 2020. So all of their local offices and their gubernatorial election, which happens every 2 years in Massachusetts, was carried by a Republican. So we were commissioned by the chair of the party up there to do some retrospective research. And we found that for really the first time ever in New Hampshire's history, voters were separating their sentiment into federal and state and local. People were so turned off by President Trump that they said, we really want to have other Democratic members in the delegation in case this guy wins. If we lose the state, if we can put our Democratic members back in Congress, that's some checks and balances, right? But we like a balanced government. So we're going to ticket split and we're going to vote for Republicans down ballot, right? We had a philosophy, or we had a hypothesis. Sununu was such a strong candidate and very, very well liked. We saw that these folks in New Hampshire could not separate that Sununu was actually a Trumper, right? So we would ask, well, he, did this with Trump, or he praised him on this. And they said, no. He's just really smart. He's playing the game. He's looking out for us in New Hampshire. So we're going to ticket split, and we want to deliver him Republicans in the legislature so he can get his agenda done and he doesn't have to worry with national politics. So this year there was a competitive gubernatorial in New Hampshire, and we thought, okay, we don't have the Sununu effect. Are people going to go back to Christmas train, right? That's not what happened at all. We have seen a development of people categorizing state and local and federal in their vote. And so in these places where we see people ticket splitting, that's a lot of what's happening, is that people are saying, well, we want a balanced government. We want something that includes a lot of different perspectives. And this is how we think we're going to get it. Now, Iowa is a little bit of a different story, right? So how many people remember where Iowa was like a real swing state? Iowa, Obama, 08, anybody? Yeah, right? The good old days. So in this case in Iowa, what we saw was a lot of folks in 2020, the state swung pretty far to the right. It went very, very red. In 2022, they commissioned a bunch of work to try and gain back incremental seats in the House and Senate. We had a gubernatorial contest at that point, but no federal race. And essentially what happened is that the Democrat in that race was substantively outspent 20 million to 1. Right? And so the trickle down effect happened and people didn't ticket split. In Iowa, they don't ticket split for checks and balances. They ticket split based off of the person, right? So it's kind of like our South Shore community here. How many of you know your state representative or you've seen them at one of these meetings, right? So in Iowa, they'll come to your house. I heard this great story once about a state representative who hadn't endorsed for Barack Obama and somebody said, Representative Jones, I can't remember who it was. That's not a bet. Why haven't you endorsed President Obama yet? You're in leadership, you're a Democrat. And they said, they haven't been to dinner at my house. And the party chair said, or the person who was volunteering with the party, they were from Florida, where I'm from, and they were from New Hampshire, said, that's crazy. The president's not going to come have dinner at your house. Well, sure enough, they told the campaign, the president went and had dinner at the house, the candidate endorsed and carried the district for Obama, right? So it's a different type of localized politics in these places that I think in some ways is really helps contextualize the way that some of these states have swung red. All of that being said, one of the most important things, and I think that this has become way more pervasive as national news has picked up this narrative, although I got to be honest with you folks, I don't watch the news a whole lot. I try to not let it cloud what I'm doing in terms of research. There is an idea that Trump won with this mandate, right? How many of you have heard that? Trump won by 1.5 or so percentage points. However, across the 7 battleground states, all of which he won, does anybody know how many votes he actually won cumulatively, all those states together by? 100,000 votes. Those elections all together in all 7 states were decided by fewer than 100,000 votes. So when we think about the localization of politics, it's really important, right? When we start to think about votes in terms of the hundreds or the thousands. Here in Massachusetts, it's very likely that we'll continue to be a federal blue state for quite some time, right? That being said, we did swing the furthest to the right that this state has seen in a very long time. And a lot of that was turnout, and it comes down to hundreds of votes, right? So, how could this have happened? Chris told me I have to be out before the lights are off. So there are a couple things that I want to talk to you folks about when it comes to messaging. So how many of you have heard all the ink spilled about what Democrats said that they shouldn't have, or what Democrats didn't say that they should have, blah, 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 so on and so forth, right? Okay, so 2 things. 1, our eventual Democratic nominee had 100 days to run a presidential campaign, right? So we can sit up here and armchair quarterback the messaging. That's not what I'm going to do here tonight. So if that's what you came for, I'm sorry to let you down. But we had 100 days to deliver our message, to deliver our nominee, to get folks to show up, to turn out to vote. I think that the momentum was very much there in our bubbles, right? But there's a whole other segment of the electorate who really didn't know Vice President Harris other than her being the vice president. I mention that because we saw an international backlash to incumbency. In fact, the only country in the world that had elections last year that was able to avoid this backlash to incumbency was Ireland. So many states, so for example, England swung to the left, right? The Labour Party came up and took power. The other party and it happened everywhere, right? We weren't immune to that. And so I think that there was also a lack of context, right? For a lot of us, myself included, where we say, hey, this actually feels really good. I got to be honest with you folks. I've been doing politics for a long time. And it hasn't been very fun lately. Are you guys having fun? No, it kind of stinks, right? It's very demoralizing, and we're folks who are like in the trenches, right? We're all sitting here on a Wednesday evening trying to fix the problem, right? But if you're the average voter, right, who has a marginal awareness of what's going on, you probably don't know who your state representative, your state senator is, you might know who your congressperson is, and you have some vague awareness of what's happening at the federal level, you're just upset. Right? You're worried about getting your kids from soccer practice. You know, are they allowed to read this book at school? How much do eggs cost? Right? Like, who's picking up what kid from where? These are the things that like folks are thinking about typically on a Wednesday night. They're not thinking about politics. So if you think about how frustrated we feel, the average person is feeling that tenfold. Right? Because there's not that same kind of engagement. Then you have a nominee switch 100 days away, right? There's no time for that person to truly sell, here's the difference in the administration to now. But for us, it felt really good, right? The nominee switch happened 2 days before my birthday. And I was like, this is the best present I've ever gotten, right? With no disrespect to President Biden, I think I have lots of hot takes on that. We certainly don't have time. But I do think that there was a feeling of enthusiasm and momentum that had been severely lacking in the months before. And we saw that in research no matter where we were. I could be in a Democratic primary in the bluest district in Massachusetts versus the depths and drudges of Florida Republican country. And Democratic motivation, we often ask it on a scale of 1 to 10, was in the 3s, the 4s, the 5s. It was very low. In an election year at that time, we expect to see people saying they're at 7s, 8s, 9s, right? So we really had folks who already were feeling frustrated. We got a little bit of a switch, but not a lot of runway, right? And then we have the massive elephant in the room around messaging. I'm happy to tell you what I saw in polling. This is maybe not the most popular thing. I've done a couple of these talks since, and I think that folks sometimes struggle to believe it. My very deep-seated opinion is that if we had not been talking about reproductive freedom in this last cycle, it would have been much, much worse for Democrats. It is very easy for people to sit back and say, we should have been talking about the economy. We should have been talking about this or that. Folks, I'll tell you, I tested economic messaging in every single piece of research that I did for 2 years leading up to this election. Yes, folks were deeply concerned about the economy. They were not buying our Democratic arguments, right? We had a challenge in terms of being the messenger, right? So there was work for us to do that we simply didn't have the runway to do in general, and then even had a shorter runway leading into the election with a new nominee, right? So one of the things that we're focused on now as we're moving into this new election cycle is folks are very concerned about the economy. We have an administration that is running rampant through our economy, right? I was just joking with my husband on the way here. We ordered some groceries to get ahead of this snowstorm, and I put a carton of eggs in the basket. And he was like, oh man, like there's no way we're getting those. And I was like, it's fine. They're in stock. I can see it on the app. And sure enough, as we were sitting here, it was like low inventory. There are no eggs. Would you like this replacement? And it was like hard-boiled eggs, right? So I'm like, no, thank you. But we do fundamentally have an economics messaging problem. I'm not here to tell you that we don't. I'm here to tell you we have a messenger problem, right? Folks are just simply not buying what we're selling. The dovetail of that is, in addition to this lower turnout, we have seen constituencies of folks who historically supported Democrats move towards supporting Republicans, right? Particularly low income, non-college educated voters, right? So these, and as well as iterations of voters of color, I'm sure many of you folks have read about Hispanic voters. We still don't necessarily have the proof of that, but I will tell you in a lot of the work that we're doing, we are certainly seeing this drop off. We're seeing major splits among Hispanic communities, particularly Hispanic men, moving to the right. However, if we vilify any of these groups, we've lost the plot, right? It's our job to bring people into the fold, not say, you're not in the fold anymore, bye, right? So that is one major critical mission that we have looking ahead to 2026. So again, reproductive freedom in many ways was a proxy for autonomy and control. It really isn't actually about abortion or reproductive healthcare services, right? It's how involved do you want the government in your life? And when people are feeling frustrated with that, it was a pretty solid message for us, as well as the fact that, there was this idea that there would be a lot of women who would respond to it. We saw that in 2022 post-Dobbs, particularly white women who stopped the red wave. That's not what happened in 2024, particularly with this messaging around returning to the states. White women showed up for Trump. We have to name that is what happened, right? Across the board. And in a lot of these states, that's coming from a place of, that won't really affect me, right? That's not really, that's not really my problem. I can't afford my kids' soccer practice or things like that. I'll be fine, right? And we did see a lot of that. But when we looked at the research, particularly with voters who are available to Democrats, in polling, we oftentimes ask two questions. One is, what is the most important problem facing your community? And this year, I started asking a new question. Pollsters, if you're listening, feel free to steal it, which is, what is the most motivating reason to show up to vote in this election, which are different. So you would see people say economics, the environment, whatever the top issue is. But when we segmented out the electorate of people who were available to switch to Democrats after they heard messaging, the number one issue among most of that segmentation was reproductive freedom. So that, to me, if we hadn't been talking about that and we had been trying to sell them something they weren't ready to buy, this could have been a lot worse, folks. I don't know if that's what you're expecting to hear, but that's very much what I believe. Then we look at some of the, other kinds of issues that were happening. We could stand here all night and talk about indoctrinated racism and sexism and all of the things that our nominee had to face and the trickle-down effect that has on the ballot. But at the end of the day, we do fundamentally need to resituate ourselves when it comes to messaging as well as messengers. We have to be the kind of folks that these coalitions that have come out of the fold, non-college educated, low-income communities of color, feel that is accessible to them, right? The Democratic coalition has largely become white, college-educated, upper income. For the first time in many decades, household incomes over $100,000 broke for Democrats, right? So that's a new trend. So if we are going to be the party of working people for working people, we have to invite working people in, right? And I think that's one of the things that in my role and my job, we're starting to try and figure out, how do we do that? If you're a working person and you don't believe me, if you don't trust me, then we have a communication problem, right? So I think that's really where we're starting, moving into this election. Beyond that, I mean, there are many other, I think many other specifics in certain geographics or areas that we could point to and say, hey, I think this was a real problem here, right? Tip O'Neill, we can't go a meeting without it. All politics really are local, even the federal races. And so there are lots of different things that happens in lots of different areas that I think folks have pointed to. If we look at how many of you folks were in Pennsylvania? Some of you said you knocked doors in other times. So when you knocked a door in Pennsylvania, who answered it? Do you remember? Under 18? Uh-oh, we got some targeting problems. How about you? Who answered the door? Did you say you? Oh, did I see another hand over here? Who answered the door when you knocked it in Pennsylvania? Anybody? Who'd you talk to, Chris?
The Trump voting husband.
Yeah, right. So one of the other things that definitely was people were betting on was that there were going to be these split ticket households, right? And we did see this. So in Missouri back in 2012, when Claire McCaskill ran for Congress, I had a friend who was out there. She worked for the Democratic Senatorial Committee at the time, and they would knock only during the day. They would talk to the wives who would be like, yes, I'm voting for McCaskill, and don't come back. And right about 6:30, she said all the trucks would pull into the driveway. And the person who answered the door would come home and say, nobody's voting here, right? And there was a big hypothesis that that's what was happening, particularly in some of these Rust Belt states. And again, that's just simply not what happened. It used to be the case that the number one indicator of how people voted on election day was their religion. Right? So in the 80s, Newt Gingrich made abortion a wedge issue, right? And that became inextricably linked with religion. But today, what do you think the number one indicator is of how someone will vote? Party. Yes, which seems so obvious, right? But it used to be the case that we had large shares of independents. Even here in Massachusetts, we have 61% of our electorate are unenrolled voters, right? But those voters have pretty strict party identification where they're not ticket splitting or bouncing back and forth anymore. Party ID or self-ID party identification is something that has become so inextricably linked with the way that people vote that we just really don't see the same behaviors anymore. So when we look at states like Florida, like Iowa, to take it back to what I was trying to say at the top of the conversation tonight, we are getting outpaced in terms of voter registration. People are registering to vote as Republicans. People are registering to vote as independents or non-party affiliation with Republican tendencies, right? When they pull a Republican primary ballot, they're probably going to vote Republican in most of the other races. So really, again, it's up to us to invite people into the fold, right? That's really one of the things that we're trying to concentrate and focus on moving into 26 and looking ahead to 28. So I have been talking for about half an hour, and I told Chris I really wanted to hear you all's questions because there are many different directions I could take this conversation. So I'm happy to take a little pause and say, is there anything that you want to hear more about, or what questions do you folks have? Don't be shy. I teach a college class. You can't scare me. Yes.
In your polling, do you ever ask, once you've said, are you going to vote this way or that way, do you ever ask why?
All the time. So we ask several different iterations of this question. I'm happy to tell you kind of what I saw this cycle. So oftentimes, I mentioned that one question, what's the most motivating issue for you to vote? That's specifically about issues. But a lot of times we ask this about candidates, right? What is the reason for you to support this candidate? And what is the reason for you to, or a lot of times I'll ask an open-ended question that's, what's holding you back from voting for this candidate? Let's talk about the second one first. Again, we are people who are in this room on a Wednesday evening for 2 hours to talk about what happened in election 4 months ago, right? So we're not these people. Most people, the number one reason that they give for why they're hesitant to vote for a candidate, specifically a Democrat, if we're talking about an electoral candidate head-to-head poll, is I don't know enough about that person. And that includes the presidential level, right? So we all here get bombarded with ads, right, from New Hampshire, and folks are confused. They don't know what to think. And also true, you know, we can point the finger at Trump all night long, but the fake news seed, y'all, that disinformation and misinformation is a massive problem. Massive. I can't understate this enough. There's also nothing we can do about it tonight, and I will get myself all riled up and it's hot up here. But it is really a challenge. And so folks say, I don't know enough, and nobody really trusts like anybody anymore, right? So there is a big sentiment of like, I need to do my own research. The second issue that we saw in why people aren't supporting folks was party. Because they're a Democrat, because they're a Republican, right? That was the other motivating factors. And then it comes down to a lot of other things. Municipal level work is different. So I'm in the field with a lot of municipal races right now. I'm in one that actually has an election in April in the Midwest. Excuse me, the number one reason that people don't like this mayor is because of crime. Even though crime statistics have gone down, homicides and violent crime in this city has gone down 20% over the course of her 4-year administration. Her, if you didn't catch that. And people say crime has gotten worse, right? So oftentimes it's a perception challenge. When we ask people, why are you supporting somebody? It's really party is number one, the first one, but people like to couch it around things like they share my values, right? We have the same priorities. All of that is just coded language for party. So I think that's a lot of times when we ask that question, what we see. Candidly, folks, voters very rarely vote on policies. I know that's very disappointing. It is for me anyway. But it is very unlikely that voters are voting on policies. Most of the time they're voting on the way that they feel, right? And who's making them feel better, who's making them feel worse. The other reason that voters vote is fear. Fear is probably the number one most motivating emotion for voters to vote. So that's why you see particularly a lot of Republicans right now fear-mongering around immigration. No one thinks fentanyl is coming from Canada, right? I mean, it's just wild. But people do fear what they're constantly told, right? And so, and we do see, we did see, it is an indisputable fact that in COVID, we did see rises, particularly in major cities, in violent random crime. That's the other key, right? So there is a big difference between random acts of violence and crime in the, in other ways, right? So whether that's robberies or gun violence or things like that, they oftentimes are sensical, but post-COVID, we've seen a pretty major rise in random acts of violence. And that fear has been used to monger other people, to say nothing about immigration. Immigration is a massive red herring where people the fear is available to be weaponized. And that is 100% what's been happening, particularly, I saw this in Iowa and I was like, what's happening here? Iowa has like a 1% immigrant population. It's very, very low. To say nothing of how few of those folks are undocumented immigrants. It was the #1 most motivating reason for people to vote for Republicans in that race was they didn't want immigration coming into their state. It was wild.
Larger than you think. I lived in northwestern Illinois for 16 years and worked in Iowa. And seasonally, there's a lot of undocumented immigrants. They all come to work farms or the meatpacking factories. So I think that might be where some of that came from.
I mean, it's also Republican fear mongering. They're running ads left and right about immigrants taking jobs and doing crime. Oh, that's probably very confusing for people who are online. Sorry, everybody. Yeah, why don't we go here and then, wait, sorry, let me do a round. So I saw a hand here and then here and then here. So we'll go online, blue, scarf, turtleneck. Great. Online, hit me.
All right.
Do you want me to just repeat it?
Emily asked, how do we reconcile the results in states where both abortion rights and Trump won on the same ballot?
Amazing question, Emily. So Emily asked, for those folks who couldn't hear it, how do we reconcile Trump winning in states where abortion rights was on the ballot? So I did a lot of work in Florida. Florida had both abortion rights on the ballot and Trump won the state handily, right? Remember the days when Florida was a swing state? It's a different time. So the answer to Emily's question is my most annoying pollster answer, but it depends. So Florida is an interesting example. So abortion rights failed in Florida and Trump carried the state. However, 57% of Florida voters voted in favor of Amendment 4, which would have protected the constitutional right to abortion. Abortion has been protected in Florida by the right to privacy in the Constitution for many, many years. That's because in Florida, you have to hit a 60% threshold. There are other states like Missouri where abortion protections actually passed and Trump won the ballot, right? There are Trump voters who think that Trump is not going to come for abortion access or reproductive freedom because he has, quote, returned it to the states. So they saw and I also think too, this is, Emily, a super scalding take. I actually think that abortion rights in some of these states created a permissive structure for voters, particularly women, to vote for Trump. So they felt like, and I don't have proof, so don't quote me if that's wrong. I've done a little bit of research on it, so I'm not just flying blind here, but I do think that in some of these states, particularly white women, thought, okay, I'm going to vote for Trump because that's what's good for my family or good for my pocketbook. But he returned abortion rights to the state with this Supreme Court overturning Dobbs. So I get to cast my vote on that and I'm going to vote for abortion rights and then I can have it all, right? It is a very privileged position, but it's the position that a lot of folks come from. And I think, we don't have a specific answer to that, but Emily, that's how I think we reconcile those things. I think in some ways it's a permissive structure. And then in other places, we, even in Florida where you saw 57%, it still didn't pass because the threshold is so high. And each individual state is really different. Florida is a funny state. honestly, candidly, abortion rights should have passed. Governor Ron DeSantis ended up using tens of millions of dollars worth of public service announcements to undermine the abortion amendment as though it was coming from the Department of Health. And then also made a case that said parental consent is a very big issue when it comes to reproductive freedom, judicial bypass, if anybody is familiar with that. So the case that was made against the abortion amendment there was if you allow this, kids can have abortions all the time whenever they want, basically. It was sponsored by the government. I think we had, I'm sorry, tell me your name. Laura.
I get one question.
Chris is in charge. I'm scared, Chris. All right. Who's from Cohasset? Unlimited. Okay. Go ahead, Laura. Yep. Yep.
All seven. And actually, if I'm really honest, hard for me to believe that really happened. I mean, I know, but it's just hard for me to believe that she would lose all seven. And then the other thing is this theory of we don't know the candidate. And again, she did only have 100 days, which I get. But we do know the other candidate. Yeah. We know the other candidate. We already had a taste of him for 4 years. So I don't get that argument. You maybe speak to that a little bit because we do know something.
Yep.
He showed us that he was. And he showed us who he was going to be again and said it and yet they went with that choice. So this false equivalency is she's got to do the work in less than the time and he didn't really need to do the work and he still gets it, even though we voted him out last.
Yeah.
So to me that doesn't go.
Yep. So let me take your first question first. So Laura asked for the folks at home. It's on the screen. Woo! Thank you. Okay. Thank you. So on the 7 states, basically what I'll go back to, Laura, is those 7 states all together, and you'll have to forgive me, it's been a minute, so I don't remember the numbers state by state. It was only 100,000 votes, right? That is marginal. That's one town, I mean, it's a very, very small percentage, and then it's even fewer by the states. So how did that happen? I mean, my personal opinion is abolish the Electoral College. It's nonsense at this point. But a lot of it too, like particularly if you look at some of the states that were lost, like Arizona, for example, pretty massive Hispanic population, right? That pretty likely swang to the right. We don't know that for sure. And I do return to my point, which is like villainizing any demographic subgroup of people is the wrong thing to take away from this. But I do think that we had messaging that was not working for those people in those states, right? However, Wisconsin, for example, we lost Wisconsin and they won back their assembly because it was gerrymandered, Laura. And so that's another big issue that we have in this country is we have a massive attack on our direct democracy. I mean, it is shocking. And so a lot of that too, I think also plays into the federal and the state and local discrepancies. So like where you saw these Michigander candidates or Wisconsinites, I mean, people were really familiar with these candidates. And then in some of the other states, you had just atrocious local candidates that Democrats were able to beat either for US Senate or for governor or something like that. So I do think that feeds into your second question, which is like, people know exactly who he was. Yeah, girl. And they did it on purpose, right? They like him. I think that's something that we're in a little bit of denial about. And the people that don't like him stayed home this time because they didn't see the alternative as any better. Remember when we think about voting as a binary choice, why this person and not that person? A lot of those people said, gross. Right? And they said, no, thank you to either one. I do think it was also partly a tie with incumbency. Criticisms of President Biden aside, again, I think we're in this national environment that has a lot to do with COVID. We're all sitting in this room, right? Like it's a different world than it was the last time we all did this 4 8 years ago. And I think that there is a massive backlash against incumbency just in general. And she did not have the runway to disentangle herself from the administration. I'm not saying that Biden was necessarily a weakness. I'm saying the incumbency component is. People have been pessimistic about the way that this country has been going for the last 3 out of 4 years. So that is almost impossible to overcome in 100 days. It doesn't matter who your nominee is. So I think a lot of these folks looked at Trump, and I'll give you an example actually of a focus group that I did with some folks in Northern Iowa, actually. I did focus groups with independent white men under 50. So you can imagine what happened in that group. But I actually had a lot of sympathy for these folks. One guy was talking about, he had voted for President Biden, and this goes back to also the messaging component that I was talking about earlier. He had voted for President Biden in 2020 and hated Trump, didn't like him at all. And this was 2022. So we were about 2 years into the last administration. And he said, I hate Trump, but I'll tell you what, I only had one job when Trump was president, and now I have 3, and I still can't pay my bills, right? That's a problem. So if all of this continues on, right? To say nothing of the fact that women always got to work harder, girl. So there just simply wasn't the sell. People were okay buying that because it was the better of 2 options by their estimation, and people stayed home. You also have to remember, young people are a whole separate situation, including young men, which is, we don't have enough time, but it's a real, again, I go back to mis and disinformation, right? I mean, it is substantive and toxic in these communities. But I will say, we haven't seen Trump in the same way that we saw him in his administration over the last 4 years. He got kicked off of Twitter. He went on to his weird Truth Social, and, he's not on TV. A lot of people forgot. They didn't like him, but it wasn't this visceral disgust that we really saw in 2020. And I think that a large product of that was that he just wasn't out much. And where he was, credit where credit's due, was incredibly targeted. He was on Joe Rogan's podcast or running very specific digital communications. I can tell you one of the things that I talked about, or I pulled right after the election, was there's it's a super hacky Democratic consultant thing called Ad Impact, and you can see, I wish I had the slide, but you can see the topic of communication that each campaign talked about. Our number 1 ad on the Democratic side from Kamala Harris, the subject matter was the economy. It was by a 3-to-1 margin. His was the bad ad, the trans ad. But it was a very targeted market. It wasn't like a broad brushstroke. It was an X-Acto knife. And I think that, is the other discrepancy of these 2 things. I think we had a question here.
Well, my comment or question really had a lot to do with the messaging, that the Republicans seem to get it, and the Democrats, are we ever going to get it? And I think your point about fear is a really good one, because that is, we couldn't, I don't know what we could strike fear in the hearts of people for, but it was just so different. It's that the Republicans just had the right messaging, and the Democrats just, joy was wonderful for us, but it doesn't do it for people in the lower middle class.
Yeah, I would add a little bit of texture to that. I see where you're coming from, and I hear you. I would add a little bit more texture, which is, before the nomination switch, we actually didn't, it wasn't that the messaging was good or bad, there just wasn't any, right? And that's a tactic. There are a lot of incredibly brilliant people who worked on the Biden and then moved over to the Harris administration. There were a lot of really great ads, right, that came out of the federal level. I think, so I mentioned that I teach, but I also train a lot. So what I like to do in my free time, is train Democrats to run for Congress or for state house or, really whatever it is. And I work for a couple different organizations. One that's local that you've all probably heard of is Emerge. And so I work with women who are Democratic women who are running for office and train them on messaging. So when I train messaging, the number one thing that we talk about is the definition of messaging, which is why vote for you and not the other person. And Democrats spend a lot of time talking about the and not the other person. And we need to be selling folks what we have to offer, right? And I think that there are some candidates who did a really good job of that. And candidly, I think if Kamala Harris had 9 months, we might be having a different conversation right now. We'll never know because that's not what happened, right? But I do think that, really as we're thinking about moving forward, because that's all we can think about right now. Sometimes I'll do anything for Chris Matthews, as should all of you. But a lot of times I don't like to do these postmortems because I think that people get so sucked into what happened or what didn't we do or what should we have done, but not to implement it in the future, just to hand-wring about it. And so really, I think the important things that come out of these conversations are like, what are we doing now? And I think the number one thing that we have to start doing now is selling people what we have to offer them. And there are some really good ways that Democrats are doing this. A lot of folks have set up like communications hubs or incubators, particularly at the state and local level. Like, hey, the Democratic legislature in Iowa just stopped they have something called area education agencies that like help kids who need special learning environments or things like that. And the Republicans wanted to strip all of it out of the budget. It would have been devastating for hundreds, if not thousands of kids in public schools in Iowa. So they have a communication incubator that says, hey, Democrats just acted as they're in the minority. So they acted as a firewall to keep this from happening. And the other thing I think we really have to address, I've been thinking about this a lot in the context of New Hampshire, although I haven't solved the problem yet, is now in a lot of these states, Democrats are in the minority. So we can't really do a whole lot in the legislature, right? If it takes 101 votes to pass and you've only got 60 people, that's tough, right? But where we have a very slim margin is the United States Congress. So I don't know what they were thinking, but so we have a lot of opportunity there, I think. And so really it's kind of up to us to be talking to our neighbors, our community. Like, I'm really excited about this thing that happened, or look at this good thing that Democrats do. And when you all get out on the doors for local elections, that starts here, right? Whether it's for select board or, whatever it is that you're passionate about. There's special in your area. Those are some of the things I think we really have to start selling, right? I think we had a question here, and then you're next. Yes. I realized I was like, I shouldn't refer to them this way. I'm so sorry. Tell me your name, please. Dawn, Jade. Of course. I think people were just like, oh, well, I know that's a horrible thing to say, and it seems remarkable to us, right? Yeah, but you know what? A lot of people have no idea what happened the last 2 weeks, right? They got a sick kid who's got norovirus. They're paying $80 to put gas in their car. Like, I cannot stress this enough. I say it at every training that I do, every one of these meetings that I'm at. Normal people are not like us, right? Like the everyday voter is not sitting in a 2-hour meeting on a Wednesday night. Right. So kudos to all of you, right, for being engaged in your community. But it's just not the way the average folks think. Right. They have no idea. And I think that the other thing, too, kind of back to your point a little bit is, Trump is atrocious. He also really has a hell of a spin. Right. And so if people just hear the soundbite, and this is where, again, mis and disinformation, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what he did, right? Like, there is no accountability or like ability to speak truth to power anymore because everything is in sound bites. So when he says like, oh, I turned the water on in California, right? That's what people think happened, right? I will give an example of one of my friend's fathers, who is like an incredibly intelligent PhD professor, moderate Republican from Florida, like reasonable guy, liked Jeb, right? Y'all remember Jeb, exclamation point? What could have been, right? I candidly would have traded that. During the allegations of the election fraud, he had just seen a clip of, in like the Wall Street Journal or somewhere that was about the UPS driver or the United States postal worker who said, yeah, I threw those ballots away or something like that. Well, it came out that that US postal worker was lying, right? He had been paid off by somebody. But my friend's father was like, well, you know, I don't know. Like, I didn't think that the election could have been stolen, but like maybe it was. And I had to say to that person, so actually like that guy came out and said he lied and he had the receipts and whatever. And their thought was, but then why didn't the paper follow that back up, right? This is a person with a PhD who's a college professor, right? So we have to remember that not everybody is getting like all 17 steps of the story. And candidly, like I think going back to your point, Laura, so many people are just disgusted that they've thrown up their hands and they've shut it out. And I think there's another component too, where there was almost like I saw this a lot in qualitative research and it's hard to describe. It was almost like a resignation, right? Of like Democratic voters who are kind of like, this tidal wave is coming and there's not a whole lot I can do about it, right? And I think that was like very discouraging for folks. Let's go. I think you had one here, then here, then here, and then I know you have another one. Yeah. Okay. I'm sorry. Tell me your name, please. Jenny.
Yeah, I'm sorry, this is the first part of the talk, so I don't know if you really addressed this, but I do think we can't discount racism and.
Oh yeah, Jenny, we had a whole conversation about that. Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
But my question is, here we are in the bluest of blue states.
Not that blue, Jenny.
Okay, well, here are the most other states.
Yes, ma'am.
What's the best thing that we can do, people like us can do to affect some positive change during the next 4 years?
I know that Chris is going to talk to y'all a little bit about action items that you can do here locally. I think that the number one thing that all of us can do is knock doors, right? Preferably not in Massachusetts. That seems, I know that everybody wants to be involved locally. You know, the folks have questions about things like, you know, postcards and stuff like that. There are studies that show that these things work, right? They're not in vain. I think the number one thing that we can all do is talk to each other, right? The other situation that's been created is there are massive communication bubbles, right? My family is all from the South. They're incredibly conservative, and I don't want to talk politics with any of them. My very best friend from childhood is an extreme right-wing, person. He's actually not a Trumper. He's a true libertarian who like wants to live off the grid and hates government. Voted for Josh Stein and you talking about ticket splitters? Somebody over here voted for Josh Stein and also voted for Trump. I don't understand it, but I do actually because I talked to him. Right. And I think that there's a lot of privilege in being able to do that. Right. And I do want to acknowledge that. I think there are folks who are hurt physically and immediately by these policies. And also, like, we have to talk to people. It's not to change their minds, it's to understand. That's like why I do my whole job. I want to understand why people think that the way they do. And then I want to figure out, okay, the people who do have open minds, how do we change those minds? And also talk to your friends, your family, your neighbors who didn't vote. There are millions of people who voted in 2020 who didn't vote again. Seek to understand why, and then meet them where they're at. I think that there is a lot of feeling, particularly from people who didn't vote or people who switched their vote, that they feel scolded. Right? That's not going to get us anywhere. But again, I do just want to acknowledge there's like a fundamental level of privilege in that, right? Where like, I am a person who is hurt by Trump policies, but not as much as other communities, right? And so I think we have to find some way to like work through that. But I think the number one thing that we can do is knock doors, right? Talk to voters, have these conversations. Chris will probably has many more ideas and calls to action than I do, but I think that's where we start. Yes, sir.
During the election and after, I talked to a lot of folks and friends, and I found a surprising number of people who told me they weren't going to vote. I said, why aren't you going to vote? I'm going to vote. They said, well, it's obvious that Kamala Harris would win. Who in their right mind would vote for Trump? And I'm very sympathetic to that, but I can't believe that anyone's stupid enough to vote for Trump. Really, when you look at what's going on now.
It's horrifying.
This isn't Mitt Romney.
Yes, sir.
Anyway, but the other side is they were not voting to express their outrage over Biden's failure to understand what was going on in Gaza and Israel. They're furious. You know, why isn't Netanyahu in jail? Upset that Biden was ignoring runaway inflation. This is a somewhat different person than the one who's concerned about Israel. Why did the administration do nothing? Almost pretend that there wasn't a severe problem with inflation. People were very upset about that. And then, then lesser, some people have no connection with immigrants at all, but yeah, be afraid of immigrants. But I think a lot of people woke up November 5th astonished that Kamala didn't win, even though they were making a statement by not voting for her, and hopefully when she was president, she realized a lot of people didn't buy her and this and this and this. I really wonder. There does seem to be some data that suggests that Joe Biden got a lot of votes in 2020 that he didn't get in 2024 because people just didn't come out. And I think you just said we ought to look at why that's happening.
Yeah, I mean,
Understand it.
to try and thread the needle here, I mean, this is where I say, like, we still don't have a lot of data, right? And so one of the things that I think, like, for example, I mentioned that retrospective that I did in 2020. I went to people who self-identified that they voted for Biden and the federal Democratic delegation and didn't vote for Democrats down ballot. And we asked why. What you're talking about, and I'm in no means trying to discredit or devalidate it, because I think, I mean, it's obvious that there are some of these sentiments that are prevalent, but what I do is broad brushstrokes of representative data, not anecdotes, right? And so I hear these anecdotes and I think, okay, that's a person's lived experience, right? And I think there's truth and validity in that. But when we try to map that onto the electorate or broad groups of people as a whole, that's just not something that we're able to do right now. We do see parts of the country where there are what we assume to be protest votes, right? So like Dearborn, Michigan, or something like that. But we don't know that unless we go and ask all of those people. We do a representative survey and say why. I don't know what those people thought when Trump said we're going to take Gaza or whatever he said this morning. Did you hear that? I was like, oh my God. Yeah. So I'm not sure. Right. And so I don't want to make, I think maybe this is a bit of a soapbox, so I hope you'll forgive me, but something I really think that we as Democrats have to try to not do broadly is make assumptions about why anybody did or didn't do anything in this last. So I say to you, like, what should we do? We got to talk to folks, right? We got to figure out where they're at and we have to meet them there. We have to bring them with. We need to call in, not call out, right? And so as we're moving forward, I think these are some of the things I'm super interested from a data perspective in trying to figure out how do we map this on to broad brushstrokes of the electorate so we can people in. I lost my list. Why don't we go to somebody online? And then did I call on someone after? Okay, yes, okay. We'll go here and no, let's go to you because I called on you first and then we'll go online.
Well, I'm just wondering, I'm thinking that we're not really talking about the elephant in the room, and that being a lack of inspiring leaders. I think that an inspiring leader can kind of level off some of these problems you're talking about. And, I voted for Kamala, and I was with her for the first 6-7 weeks, but I got tired about hearing about her mother, hearing about her sister, and whatever.
having somebody like a Barack Obama, hey, having Michelle Obama would be wonderful.
That is what I yelled on my birthday. I was like, Michelle.
I mean, so we do have all these other problems that you're talking about, but I think an inspiring leader can bring you beyond some of these problems.
I think that that's going to look different for every single person in this room, right? Because I'll tell you, I found Kamala Harris to be an incredibly inspiring person, but that's my lived experience, which is different than yours. I bet we grew up super different, but maybe not.
Could we agree that Michelle
Yeah.
Obama is an inspiring speaker?
Yeah, but then we could also have a whole conversation about how she's never held elected office, right?
But on the other hand, I mean, there's gotta be people.
Yeah.
There's gotta be people out there.
So, I'm sorry?
Michelle
Michelle
Obama.
Obama. Yeah. Yes, sir. No, but this is, I think this is actually this is actually a great illustration of how voters are all different. None of us are a monolith, right? So when I do my work, I do use broad brushstrokes to say people on the South Shore of Massachusetts feel this way, or, you know, white women over the age of 40 feel this way. I mean, these are all things, like, there are limitations to what we can do. And I think that's why it's so important to have conversations, particularly at the local level, because you want to talk about how to get a leader that's maybe inspiring to more people than they aren't. It's building a pipeline, right? It's why I'm so passionate about doing work training Democratic women to run for office, because I want there to be a pipeline. I want there to be a wealth of candidates, right? Where we're not talking about one or two individual folks. So, you know, really also, I keep picking on your question here, but like, what else can we do? If you see somebody who inspires you in your community, encourage them to run for local office, get them in the pipeline, right? Chris, you want to online me?
So we have two questions from Becky Plata, who was our nominee in the Democratic nominee for Jeff Perry.
Yep.
Great candidate. She has two questions that are kind of tied together. First, how do we counter massive right-wing media, podcasts like Rogan, et cetera, that creates fertile ground for their election messages? And then the second piece of that is how do we test underlying beliefs about the world that are shaped by right-wing media?
So on that, how do we combat that? There are a lot of people working on this issue, right? I am a pollster. That is not my area of expertise, but I will go back to the number one thing that we can do is talk to other people, right? And if you start to hear these talking points, there are ways to push back on them or to have conversations with folks about the things that they're hearing. You know, we as individuals only have, like, we all have limitations to our power. You know what I mean? Like, I can't go in and fix the right-wing media. I certainly wouldn't have done it. There are entire think tanks that are dedicated to that. One of my clients actually is focused entirely on just combating mis and disinformation among Hispanic populations, which, you know, a lot of the answer to that is communicate to folks in their preferred language of communication, right? Like, that's number one. These podcasts, I think in some ways they're a big problem, and in other ways they're a red herring, right? Like, there's a, where is that coming from, right? And it's like, there's a rot, right? Like so I think that's part of what we have to consider as we're thinking about that. What was the other question? How do we test it? How do we test it? I mean, a lot of that is people's lived experiences, right? I mean, I think we have a lot of people who are having very different, there are a lot of people in this world who are having massively different lived experiences than I am. And so particularly when I'm working in a community where I see, it's like if I'm working in Florida, if I'm working in the Panhandle where I'm from, which is Matt Gates's district is next door to mine. You guys know that guy? Yeah, he was in the legislature when both of my husband and I were working in Florida politics, and we're roughly the same age, and yikes. But you know, a lot of what, how do we test those beliefs is a lot of the work that I'm doing, and it is listening to them in a qualitative scenario. Tell me about what you think. What makes you feel that way? What would change your perspective or your world? A lot of it isn't facts. It's having a different experience. Meghan McCain is a great example of this. So Meghan McCain used to be massively against paid family medical leave, right? It was like something she went on The View and she talked about all the time. And, everybody figured you can figure it out and blah, 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 until guess when? That's right. Meghan McCain had a baby and all of a sudden girl was for paid family medical leave, right? And I do think it goes back to some of these conversations that we were having about we have to sell what Democrats have to offer and show them how these policies can change and shape their lives for the better. But how do we test that? It's like, it goes back to the fundamental problem of like, what will they buy from us, right? How do we make them believe these things? And I think there's still a lot of work to be done on that. Okay, let's go here and then here and here. Yes.
I understand your message, and I agree that, Democrats have to tell people what we stand for, what the policies, how it benefits people, but I think everybody already knows that. And I don't understand why Democrats aren't stronger and louder and more in your face about what the Republicans are saying, what their lies are doing to your lives. They are not the fiscally conservative party. If you look at all of Steve Radner's charts or whoever else can show you statistically that whenever there's a Republican president, things go down. Democrats have to come in and fix it again. And that's only one example. The hypocrisy that goes on is we all see, witness it, and it makes our heads blow off. But why aren't the leaders, the Democratic leaders, screaming this? And why isn't the media, countering it immediately? That's a lie. That's not true. I can't watch the shows anymore. I stopped watching the Sunday shows years ago, because I can't take it. You're like, say that, don't let them get away with that. They're getting away with it all the time. And their messaging is just so loud. It's forceful. It's constant. It's unrelenting. It's because when you keep telling a lie, people will believe it. So the misinformation is just out of our control now. And the only way I think we can try to counter it is to come at it with the same force. And it has to be immediate. You can't let someone say something and then hope that maybe somebody will counter it, but nobody's going to hear it.
Yeah. So we saw this a lot in focus groups that I did last cycle, which was that folks, even very strong Democrats, but the strongest Democrats wanted Democrats to come on stronger. That is not the sentiment of most voters, I'll tell you, at least not in the work that I've seen. That being said, I also think this is way outside of the scope of my professional expertise as a pollster, and we don't have nearly enough time because Chris said 8:30. But money in politics, folks, is a bad thing. And a lot of this is, I think we can't ignore like why people do things. Like, you know what I mean? A lot of folks on both sides of the aisle have lots of money that come into these races, particularly at the federal level. One thing that voters really did respond to this last cycle, coming from Democrats around the economy, were particularly at the legislative level, that there was an idea that Democrats could stand up to like big pharma or special interest groups. Like they do have the power to do some of that stuff. A lot of folks don't know that. And a lot of these places where it does have efficacy, Democrats are in the minority and they're not able to do that. And also a lot of them need that money to fund their races, right? So, there's a lot that is like a very tangled web of like, why are electeds doing things or not doing things? I don't know. I don't work for elected leadership like in that way. But I do think that there are a lot of elected officials who are doing what they can to speak truth to power, right? Whether those tactics are what will be employed by everyone, that's so broad and so broad reaching. The other thing I will just say though, is that right now, I really think, this is not the most sophisticated take, but I really think that Republicans are louder because there's more of them. And we have to accept that right now. Here, and then I feel like you've raised your hand like 9 times. I'm so sorry, but I can't tell if you're in it or you're out. Okay, okay. Okay.
What do you think it means about our electorate that more of us voted for convicted felons?
I personally, and this is in no way to push back or be disrespectful to the question, I don't believe that felony convictions like should really be like a part of the conversation, like in the way that I think that they have become a part of the narrative, right? One of the crown jewels of my career so far has been returning the eligibility vote back with people with felony convictions. And that was for people who sped 30 miles over the speed limit, which happened to be a felony in Florida, and people who committed multiple violent crimes, right? I think the bigger issue is not the felony conviction, it's what it was, right? And so, yes, but also, I actually don't think that's true for a lot of voters. I think that like a rap sheet is disqualifying. And so I think that part of the answer to that question is that we, and I put myself included in this in campaigns that I worked on, got more focused on the conviction than what happened behind it. A lot of voters, if you ask them in quantitative research, don't even know what Trump's conviction is for, right? So we have to tell people that, not that it's a felony, but that it is, you know, what he did, right? It's not about the legal the legal part of it, right? Which is like if it's a misdemeanor or a felony or whatever, it's what he did, right? And like the risk to democracy. Second to reproductive freedom, the top issue was threat to democracy, but that was defined incredibly differently by both parties, right? And so I think that in some ways, we kind of lost the thread. I will say internationally, this was a massive deal for people abroad, where I think like criminalization and things like that people are barred from holding office, from voting, things like that. And it was really something that we failed to explain, right? I think that that's a big part of it, is what he did. And I think that's, you know, an issue. In terms of also what it says about us, I also think that there's a massive part of electorate, many of whom are election deniers, who think that that was all set up and fraud, right? And that is just what they think. Going back to disinformation and underinformation. It's a tough place to be in. Yep.
All right, I'm going to kind of move in a little different direction. What about personality, charisma, salesmanship, the things that I know, to go back to John Kennedy, and the Kennedy-Nixon debates, for example. He was there. He looked good. Nixon looked like he was sweating, and, you know, Kamala in the debate just tromped all over.
Yeah, she whooped him.
And, you know, and then Trump would not debate her again. And
would you?
and the point I'm trying to make is, I think also the people knew Trump. He was on TV, and they didn't know Harris. And she had to do something about that. And the best time to do it, I think, would have been in the debate or a series of debates. And I think we've moved away from it. And certainly the style that we had back when John Kennedy debated is totally different today and too controlled and too, I don't know, manipulated. To see the personalities come out and see people as they really are. I think that would have made a big difference.
Yeah, I will tell you, I mean, statistically, and in terms of when we ask this question, the people who watch debates mostly are the people who are already decided. So that is, I mean, that's also a different product of today's very intensive news environment also.
He also was not in front of the people very often, and so they didn't see her. They didn't know her like they do Trump.
Yeah, and I think there's also the question of like how many debates could she do in 100 days? You know, I mean, I think that's a real challenge. There were a couple of different, you know, like interviews that she did or sit downs with that. And I think there were a lot of people who had feelings on those on both sides. But I think at the end of the day, in terms of like, what could we have done? Again, it's just like wave a magic wand and get more time. You know, I think that's a part of it. And you've had your hand up so long. Thank you for being so patient. Yeah.
Just had a question about the polls.
It's fuzzy.
I know.
You got to
it's
talk
weird.
right into it.
The polls for Hillary Clinton and then the polls for Kamala, everybody was surprised, like that gentleman said, the next day for both women. So how did the polls be so wrong? And then the second part of the question is, with AI coming about, how are you going to do your job polling wise?
Girl. No, so I'll say tell me your name. Teresa's first question was, people seem surprised after 2016 and again here in 2024. How are the polls wrong? I will, with no disrespect to Teresa, reject that actually on its head. So polls in 2016 were almost spot on in terms of the popular vote, Teresa. Most polls had Hillary Clinton winning by 1 to 2 percentage points, and she in fact won by 1 to 2 percentage points. When we looked at, so we made adjustments in 2016 in state by state polling, because where there were bigger discrepancies in polling were actually some of the states like Rust Belt states, Wisconsin, Michigan, not me, but we did see that they were very close. And a lot of the product of that is what came out of the 2016 election, which was weighting based off of college education. And we've always weighted on gender identity and ethnicity, but it became even more important to make sure you had the right distribution of non-college educated men, particularly in the Midwest and a lot of the Rust Belt states. In 2020, so we had some of the most accurate polling that we've ever had in 2018. 2022 actually saw the lowest polling error of the modern age, lowest polling error in 40, 50 years. It was incredibly accurate. 2020, we did see some suppression of Republican vote, but Democratic vote in almost all polls had nearly zero error. So a lot of what we had to look at and say, and I actually said this, it is my prized moment of being a pollster. I was on a panel the day after the election, and there were all these pollsters on there that were like, we got it wrong, polls are broken. And I was like, no, they weren't. They were exactly right in Democratic primaries. There were no misses in primaries. All the presidential primary polling, local primary polling, on. And when you weight a poll, right, you want it to be representative. So you make sure that you have the right distribution of people by party identification, different demographics, whatever. And I said, I think we had the wrong Republicans in a lot of these polls, because what we saw were Democratic numbers were breaking almost exactly as the expected outcome, but Republican support was suppressed. I will give an example from my own work. Does anybody remember Madison Cawthorn? Remember that guy? Yeah, he's great. Not at all. So I had the privilege of doing the work for the Democratic challenger, Mo Davis, to Madison Cawthorn, and all of our polls indicated that the race would be very, very close, maybe a point or two. However, we had about 6% of every poll that we did that had undecided voters in it. You all will remember, I just told a story about under 50 white independent men. Guess who all those 6% were? They were not going to vote for a Democrat, but they did not want to tell anybody that they were going to vote for a literal Nazi, right? And so we saw major underrepresentation of that. And I remember getting in a conversation with some of the other consultants, and they were like, we got to do a persuasion. And I was like, no, we need to do turnout, because these people are all going to break for Cawthorn, right? And that's exactly what happened. We saw that a ton in 2020. So what we did to adjust in 2022 was we actually did a couple of things, but primarily we started waiting on 2020 recall. So we would ask a question at the end, did you vote for the president in 2020? Who did you vote for? And we would make sure that we had enough people who indicated that they voted for Trump, that it was roughly similar to what the electorate looked like. Massachusetts was odd in the sense that it almost constantly, I got a ton of crap this last cycle because my polls were really conservative. And it's because people were waiting on 2020 recall, but it was making them more Democratic. And I was like, this isn't the case. If you live here, you know people are not happy. And that's exactly what happened in there with these like massive swings. So I do, however, think there's something called the Bradley effect that happened for the mayor of Los Angeles, basically where the hypothesis was that there was a big swing in the election results separate from polling because one of the candidates was Black. And then it was, racism, and people didn't want to indicate that they wouldn't vote for a Black candidate. There's no way to prove that, right? And this was, I think, like the 60s or 70s. But, certainly to the point that was made earlier, and I think we've talked about a lot tonight, I mean, it is not questionable that indoctrinated racism and sexism plays a big part in that. There's something called social desirability bias, but we're seeing less and less of that as it becomes more and more okay to be outwardly both of those things, right? But I will say in 2020, the way that we adjusted for that, I think made polls really accurate. And then here in 2024, there were very few polls. I think that what you're getting at in terms of like, people were very surprised that Kamala didn't win. I wasn't. I woke up on Tuesday morning and thought, all of my polls are going to be right and we're going to get whooped, or all of my polls are going to be wrong and it's going to be okay. And neither scenario is actually great for me personally or professionally, right? But I think that there was just such an enthusiasm, like particularly in these spaces, that it did feel shocking. And in fact, I remember going into the last weekend before the election. Well, the one big polling miss this cycle, bless her heart, was Ann Seltzer. Poor went out for the poor Iowa Register pollster. She does not wait on 2020 recall. And so I think that was a major part of that. And also her methodology. It just completely missed Republicans. But I was in the field about a week before her and had it completely the other way around. So I think that was just kind of a tough situation. But the Seltzer poll came out, and then I was on the ground in Atlanta, Georgia, and I was at a pretty like moderate area of the city, and it was real fun. We were at a Halloween party with my nephew who was dressed as Big Bird. I was Snuffleupagus, and people were talking about the election. They were talking about Kamala Harris, but the thing that they kept saying, and it felt really good. And I remember talking to some of my clients and being like, folks, I might be wrong. And we've underestimated Democratic enthusiasm. So like that is a possibility that could happen. And I would be excited about that. I'd be happy to be wrong in that situation. But the one thing that stuck out for me, and these are, folks mostly 30 to 45, all of whom have young kids, none are very political. It was just like a normal block party. And folks kept saying, yeah, I'll probably vote for Kamala Harris, but I just want it to be over. And I would bet about half of those people didn't show up and vote. I think I might have time for one more question, but I see Chris lurking towards me. Yeah. I just want to make sure I get everybody's questions. No. Yes.
So if folks need to leave, totally understand. Just want to make sure we go out through the door on the first floor here, right out to the parking lot. If Jane wants to stay and continue to take questions, we're happy to go on as long as Jane wants to. If folks want to speak individually after she finishes too, more than welcome to. Just remember those lights turn off. So the other piece, as you're leaving, John Bose is going to accost you with some action items that you can sign up for. And also, no, it's not. And then we have some Social Democratic Caucus events that are coming up, some Social Dem events that are coming up. John has information about them, but this Friday is his first postcard party, first Friday postcard party. And instead of contacting voters out of state, we're actually contacting Democratic activists on the South Shore, and we're trying to get them to come and join us and get activated. And the invitation is to a volunteer fair at the Marshfield Library on March 29th, where we're going to have groups like the ACLU, but also our Democratic town committees, so folks can plug in, and hopefully we're going to have more direction from the National Party as to what actions we can take that are constructive to push back beyond just calling our senators and representatives, which is very important. The other piece, there was a slide on it, forgot to mention it. There is a listening tour by the Mass Dems. If you go to massdems.org, there's more information. If you live in the 8th Congressional District, which is Congressman Lynch, it's on February 11th. If you live in the 9th Congressional District, which is Congressman Keating, it is February 13th. Yes, do I have those dates wrong? Sorry, February 10th and February 13th, I believe. Go to massdems.org. The information's there. It's virtual. You'll have 2 minutes to ask questions. And then finally, Jane mentioned candidate training. Anybody here want to run for local office? Anybody know someone that would be great running for local office?
Everybody knows one person.
And the most important thing to do is what? What do you do?
Ask them.
There we go.
Especially if they're a woman. They need to be asked 6 times more than men.
So we're going to do a candidate training. It's going to be, the first one's going to be virtual, but the focus is on the resources the party has to provide. And I'm going to be leaning on some friends that are Democratic trainers and asking them for a favor to come and speak. So, and we're going to have some local elected officials who, with like a priority on younger folks with younger families to show that it is possible to balance the family and the elected experience. I'm going to hand it back to Jane. Actually, one last announcement I forgot to introduce. We have our Plymouth County Register of Deeds, John Buckley, with us. Very grateful that he joined us. And sorry for forgetting to introduce you. And that's all I've got. So Jane can go on as long as she wants. Just remember, those lights go off at 9, and the town administrator, Jim Boudreau, has told me that it's on us if somebody gets hurt. So just please go out.
Yeah. I feel like there's a couple people that I called on and missed. So I feel like you have a question here. Anybody else? I'm happy to take 1 or 2 more. Okay, go ahead. Yes, ma'am.
I think that the Democrats have to do a better job of bullet points. These are the 4 things that I'm for. Well, the 3 things that I'm for. I have a brother who voted for Trump. I asked him why he was voting for Trump, and he said, because my Social Security isn't going to be taxed.
Yeah.
So, and I can say the 4 bullet points of people who voted for Trump, and I'm kind of about necessarily the conversation.
Yeah. Well, moving forward, I think this is a good note to end on. Unless there are any other burning questions, I'm happy to hang out here for another minute or 2. But I think that's a lot of what, and obviously Chris just gave all of these amazing action items. That's a lot of what we can do as activists, as volunteers. Kamala Harris can't get to every single person in Marshfield, right? She can't get to every single person in New Hampshire. We probably can't either, but we can help in those efforts. And so I think a lot of that is incumbent upon us to make sure we're helping with that. But I hear you on sort of that, how do we get that messaging across for sure. So lots of folks headed out. I'm happy to have been with you this evening. If you have any other questions for me, Chris knows where to find me. Thank you all for coming, for being here, for all the work that you do in our communities and outside of the state, and have a great evening. Yeah.